Hi, this is Joyce Farrow. Let's look at control break logic. Here's a typical data file of company clients. The file contains the last name and the state of residence of each client. A real data file might have many more fields, but this is enough for us to understand a control break report. So, all the Alabama residents come first, then North Carolina, then South Carolina, and finally all the residents in Tennessee. Here's a report that you might want to create from this data file. It has a heading, Company Clients, and then it lists all the clients in Alabama. Then there's a count for the number of Alabama residents. Then it lists the resident from North Carolina and a count, the two from South Carolina and their count, and finally the last three from Tennessee and their count. Here's the mainline logic for this program. You would start the program and then make some declarations. There's a spot in memory for the input file that holds the client's names and states. There's a title for the top of the report. That's a constant that holds company clients. And there's room for a name and a state for each client, a count, which is initialized to 0, and a string called old state, which will be used to hold the state that we're currently working on to compare it to a new state to see if it's time for a control break. After the declarations have been made, it's time to perform the getReady module. In the getReady module, the first thing you do is output the title, Company Clients, onto the report. Then you can open the input file so that all the clients' names and states are available. When you input the name and the state from the input file, the first record, Walters in Alabama, goes into memory. Then you set old state to the current state, so at the beginning of the program, state and old state are both Alabama. You return from the getReady module and go back to the mainline logic where you check for end of file. It's not end of file because we've only read just the first record into memory, so you can go to the produceReport module. Within the produceReport module, the first thing you do is compare the current state to the old state. The state in memory for the current record is Alabama, and the old state is Alabama because we just set them equal at the end of the getReady module. So it's not time to do a control break report. State and old state are equal, so you output the name and the state from memory onto the report. That's Walters and Alabama. Then you add 1 to count, so count becomes 1, and you've produced 1 record. You can then input the next name and state from the input file. In this case, they're Harris and Alabama. When you exit the produceReport module and return to the mainline logic, it's still not end of file, so you go back to the produceReport module. There, you compare state to old state. The new state for Harris is Alabama, and the old state was Alabama, so they are equal, and you simply output Harris and Alabama. You add 1 to count, so count becomes 2 because you've produced 2 records, and you get the next name and state from the input file. In this case, they're Parker and Alabama. You leave the produceReport module, go back to mainline, check for end of file. You're not at end of file yet, so you can go back to produceReport. In the produceReport module, you compare state and old state. They're both Alabama, so you output Parker and Alabama onto the report. Count becomes 3, and you get the next record from the input file. The next record happens to hold Jenkins from North Carolina. You return from the produceReport module, check for end of file, and go back to the produceReport module. Now in the produceReport module, when you compare state to old state, they are not equal. It's true that they are not equal. The current state is North Carolina, but the old state is Alabama. So it's time to perform the control break module. In the control break module, you output the count for Alabama. The old state is 3. It's important to use the old state because that's the one for which you're producing the count. Then, because the new state is going to be North Carolina, you set the count to 0, so it's ready for the new state. Finally, you set old state to state, so old state becomes North Carolina. Old state is the control break field that you now set equal to the current state that you're working on. When you return from the controlBreak module, you go back to the produceReport module where you can now output the name and the state for Jenkins. Jenkins has been waiting in memory while the count for Alabama was produced and the count reset to 0 and the old state set to state. So now it's Jenkins' time to be output. You then add 1 to count. There's 1 record for the new state, and you input the next name and state from the input file. These happen to be Lewis and South Carolina. You return from produceReport, go back to the mainline logic, check for end of file, and go back to produceReport again. When you get back into produceReport, you compare state to old state. They're different again. State is South Carolina and old state is North Carolina. So it's time for another controlBreak. In the controlBreak module, you output the count for the old state. The count for North Carolina is just 1. Then count is set to 0 for the new state, and old state is updated to be equal to South Carolina. You then can return from the controlBreak module. If you continued on, you'd output all the records for South Carolina, and then you'd output their count, and then you would output all the records for Tennessee. And as you continued reading records from Tennessee, at one point you'd go to input the next name and state, and you would reach the end of file. You would not yet have produced the count for Tennessee because you would not know you were going to reach the last record. So you would return from the produceReport module, go back to the mainline logic, and this time it is into file, so you can call the finishUp module. In the finishUp module, you'd output the count for the last state, Tennessee. In this case, it's count 3. And then you can close the input file and return from the finishUp module. Back in the mainline logic, you stop the program, and you've successfully produced the controlBreak report. Thanks for watching.